The world remembers kings, conquerors, and empires, but heaven remembers men and women who walked by faith. After the apostles of the Lamb, God never stopped raising witnesses. They preached when it was illegal. They believed when it was dangerous. They endured when it cost them everything. This is heroes of faith, the true stories of believers whose lives proved that God is real. His power is timeless, and faith still changes the world. Kindly like, share, and subscribe, and let their faith strengthen you.
She came out of the desert on her hands and knees. It was June 23, 1926. The sun over the Arizona border town of Agua Prieta was merciless. A woman stumbled through the dust, her dress torn, her hands bleeding, her lips cracked from dehydration. She had been walking for 17 hours through the Sonoran Desert, barefoot in some stretches, guided only by the distant lights of a border town. When she finally collapsed against the gate of a Mexican farmer named Ramon Gonzalez, she whispered a name that would send shockwaves across an entire nation. She was Aimee Semple McPherson, and the world had declared her dead 36 days ago. Back in Los Angeles, 10,000 of her followers had been holding vigil on the beach where she vanished. Deep-sea divers had combed the ocean floor. Airplanes had scanned the waters from Santa Monica to Venice. One man had died of exposure searching for her body. A woman had thrown herself into the sea to be with her in death. Newspapers from New York to London had run her obituary. The Angelus temple chimes had rung their morning bells. But here she was, alive, burned, bruised, and barely breathing, but alive. What on earth had happened to this woman? Who was she? And why did her disappearance bring an entire city to its knees? To answer that, you have to go back to the very beginning. You have to go back to a cold Canadian night in 1890, to a farmhouse in Salford, Ontario, where a desperate young woman climbed the stairs of her home, shut the door behind her, and fell to her knees beside her bed in prayer. Her name was Minnie Kennedy, and she was 18 years old, married to a farmer 3 decades her senior, and aching with a longing she could not silence. She had given up her missionary calling to become a farmer's wife, and the guilt of that surrender was eating her alive. She opened her Bible to the story of Hannah, the barren woman who made a covenant with God. And Minnie prayed what may be one of the most consequential prayers ever prayed by a mother. "If you will only hear my prayer," she wept, "and give me a little baby girl, I will give her unreservedly into your service. She will preach the word I should have preached, fill the place I should have filled, and live the life I should have lived in thy service." While she was still praying, the clouds outside her window parted. A shaft of sunlight cut through the gray Ontario sky, moved across the valley, swept through the orchard, and fell directly through the window onto Minnie's face. She took it as God's answer. 9 months later, on October 9, 1890, a baby girl was born in that farmhouse. Minnie, not yet fully conscious from the labor, cried out before anyone could tell her the child's gender, "Where is she? Bring her here." She had never doubted for a moment that God had given her a daughter. They named her Aimee Elizabeth Kennedy. From the very first breath, this child belonged to God. Before she could read, she was standing on drumheads at street corners reciting Bible stories. Before she turned 8, she had taken the class blackboard from a crowd of boys and girls in a school photograph, having beaten them all back with it, and sat between the knees of her terrified schoolmaster, holding the sign with the defiant calm of a general. She was willful, brilliant, and catastrophically funny. She glued her teacher's chair, locked him in the gymnasium, and caused such havoc that her parents had to purchase land in another school district just to get her transferred. She grew up surrounded by animals, owls that tracked her with their unblinking eyes, guinea pigs she defended with fierce devotion, a bull that charged her in the barnyard when she was barely 4 years old. The bull knocked her down twice in the mud. She got up both times. On the second time, bleeding from her chin, she scrambled through a tunnel of lumber and ran for the farmhouse, still clutching the bucket of cedar chips she had been sent to collect, because it never once occurred to Aimee Kennedy to let go of what she had been given to carry. That detail matters, because it would define her entire life. When she was 15, Aimee encountered Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in her schoolbooks, and the collision between science and faith sent her into a crisis so severe that she wrote a letter to the largest newspaper in Montreal demanding answers. The letter triggered a worldwide response. Letters from ministers, scientists, and archbishop, all pouring into a farm in rural Ontario, addressed to a teenage girl. She debated her professor until he fled the room. She cornered the local minister on the question of divine healing until he ran out of answers. She went to a revival meeting dressed in an ice skating costume and argued scripture with the preacher's entire family until a crowd gathered around her. She was brilliant and furious and unspent, and she had nowhere to put her gifts. And then, in December of 1907, she walked into a small revival meeting on a cold evening in Ingersoll, Ontario, and a tall, chestnut-haired Irish evangelist stepped to the front of the room. His name was Robert James Semple. He opened his Bible to the 2nd chapter of Acts, and he began to speak one word over and over, slowly, with his whole soul in it. Repent. 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 The word, Aimee would later write, pierced her like an arrow. Cold shivers ran up and down her back. She had never heard anyone preach like this. He divided the entire world into 2 categories in a single sermon, and when she left that meeting, she was never the same again. She burned her ragtime music and her dancing slippers in the wood stove. She missed rehearsal for the Christmas play. She gave her heart to God in a sudden rush of light on a lonely country road, weeping and singing hymns all the way home through the snow. And she fell completely, desperately, helplessly in love with Robert Semple. He was her first love, her teacher, her theological seminary. He taught her to read the Bible aggressively, to annotate, to wrestle with every verse. He proposed to her while they were both kneeling beside a sick child's bed, watching through the night, and when he told her he was called to go to China as a missionary, she said yes before he finished asking. They were married on August 12, 1908, beneath a cedar bower wound with golden blossoms on the Kennedys' farm, and Aimee wore white silk and carried roses, and the sun shone on everything. But God had not promised her sunshine forever. They sailed from Liverpool with barely enough money for the passage, arrived in Hong Kong in the summer of 1910, and within weeks both were felled by the brutal heat and tropical disease. Malaria struck them hard. By August they were both bedridden, too weak to nurse each other, burning with fever on opposite sides of a hospital ward on the mountain above the harbor. 5 days after their second wedding anniversary, Robert James Semple, tall, blue-eyed, laughing, beloved, died. He was 29 years old. And Aimee was 20, pregnant, and alone on the other side of the world. She sat up in her hospital bed every morning and screamed at the white walls. A month later she gave birth to a daughter, 4.5 pounds, barely alive, and named her Roberta Star, because this child was the only star of hope in a darkness so complete that Aimee could not see beyond it. She sailed back to America with the baby on her lap, and a photograph from that journey shows the most heartbreaking image. A young mother, hollow-eyed, wrists too thin, with a newborn blur across her knees. She looks like a child who has discovered grief and cannot put it down. She remarried out of desperation. Harold McPherson was kind and solid and safe, and she tried, Lord knows she tried, to be the wife he wanted. They moved to Providence, Rhode Island. They had a son, Rolf. She polished the mahogany furniture until the polish wore off. She kept the shutters closed because the sunlight hurt her eyes. She lost weight. She lost sleep. She lost her will to live. Doctors said she would lose her mind if something wasn't done. One night they put her on a table for what would be her 3rd surgery in as many years, and this time she did not think she would get up. From the operating table, semi-conscious under the ether, Aimee Semple McPherson began to preach. Doctors heard her calling souls to her in a strange, high voice as the anesthesia stole her senses. Interns carried her to the room where they took people to die. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the nurse felt her patient's breathing stop high in her throat. And in that moment of complete darkness, from somewhere inside a dying woman's spirit, a voice spoke with absolute clarity. The same voice that had been following her since her conversion. The same voice that had given her no rest in Providence while she mopped floors and prayed for death. It said, simply and finally, now. Will you go?" And Aimee, with what she believed was her last breath, whispered that she would go. And she did not die. 2 weeks later she was up. The pain was gone. And she was done trying to fit into someone else's life. On a night while Harold McPherson worked his night shift, Aimee bundled her 2 small children into warm clothes, called a taxi, and boarded the 11:55 train to Canada. She left Harold a telegram. It read, "I have tried to walk your way and have failed. Won't you come now and walk my way? I am sure we will be happy." It was 1915. She had no money, no plan, and no tent. She had 2 babies, a battered Bible, and the unshakable conviction that God had called her to preach. The summer of 1915 found her standing on a wooden chair on a street corner in Mount Forest, Ontario, her arms raised straight above her head, her eyes closed, completely still. She had been standing there for an hour. She was 24 years old, beautiful in the intensity of her concentration, and she was praying that God would fill the small mission hall down the street. A crowd gathered around her, arguing about whether she was alive or catatonic. An old farmer swore she had been there since the sun was above the pine trees. A doctor reached out and touched her arm. Her eyes snapped open. And then this slender young woman in a white dress leaped off the chair, hooked her arm through the back of it, and began running down Main Street. "People," she shouted. "Come and follow me. Quick." Boys came first. Then men. Then women. They chased her through the grocery and the dressmakers, past the bank and the print shop, right through the open door of the Victory Mission. The usher locked the door behind them. And Aimee Semple McPherson began to preach. She never had trouble drawing a crowd again. Within a week the crowd had swelled to 500. She raised $65 in a single offering, bought a tent full of holes and mildew for exactly that price, and spent the night with the women of that town sewing patches by candlelight until they could raise it. Her first tent meeting stood through a supernatural rainstorm. She commanded the canvas to stop tearing in the name of Jesus, and a seam caught on a nail and held, and the farmers in their overalls walked the aisle weeping to give their hearts to God. One by one, town by town, harvest by harvest. She packed her children and her mother into an automobile called the Gospel Car, painted with the words "Jesus is coming soon" on one side, and "Where will you spend eternity?" on the other, and drove it from Ontario to Florida, through the Carolinas, across Georgia, through rainstorms and deserts, through mountains with no guardrails and mud so deep the wheels sank to the axles. She drove it herself. She fixed the flat tires herself. She slept in the car with her children and her mother bundled under a buffalo robe. She preached from the back seat through a megaphone to sharecroppers in tobacco fields. She bought a tambourine and held street meetings in every city and crossroads town she passed through. When the family was flat broke and had nothing to eat, she gave her last nickel to a beggar. And 3 hours later, a crate of canned goods arrived from a church hundreds of miles away, shipped by people she had never met, who said they had felt an urge from God to send food to the missionary widow and her children. This happened over and over. God's provision was so consistent, so precise, that her young son Rolf once asked, after stepping on a nail that should have crippled him, and finding not a trace of the wound the next morning, "Mama, what did God do for the Israelite children when their feet grew?" And when Aimee laughed and said she supposed he stretched their shoes, the children prayed that night, and the shoes that had been too small fit perfectly in the morning. These were not theatrical faith claims. They were a family's daily bread. But the miracles that would shake the continent were only beginning. In 1916, a semi-literate woman in Corona, Long Island wrote Aimee a barely legible letter saying that for 2 years she had been lying on her face before God, praying for a revival. God had told her Aimee was the one. Aimee arrived to find no church arranged, no hall booked, no congregation assembled. Her hostess spread blackberry jam on a slice of bread and announced, cheerfully, "I've got it all prayed through." Within a week the Swedish Methodist Church was overflowing into the streets. A distinguished matron named Mrs. John Lake fell unconscious in her pew and woke speaking in a language she had never learned, her face suffused with light. A Baptist minister named Boughton, who had warned his entire congregation to stay away from the Pentecostal meetings, found himself saying "Amen" before he realized his mouth was open. And on the night he fell backward from the chancel rail in a trance, His wife came running down the aisle screaming that he was dying, while Aimee calmly told her to wait, and Boughton rose from the floor speaking in tongues, declaring he had entered the city of God. And then came Louise Mesnick. She entered the Free Gospel Church in a taxicab, twisted into a shape that scarcely resembled a young woman. Rheumatoid arthritis had seized every joint in her body. Her neck was so fused she could not raise her head. Her fingers were gnarled into claws. She had not lifted her hands above her chin in years. When Aimee saw her, she hesitated. "How I did wish," she later admitted, "that I could begin with someone who looked a bit more mendable." But the crowd was watching, and Louise Mesnick was already being carried to the front, and there was no backing down now. Aimee laid her hands on the woman's head and prayed. And Louise Mesnick slowly, impossibly, lifted her arms. 1 inch. Then another. Then above her head. The crowd gasped as fingers that had been locked in deformity straightened out one by one. The chin that had been frozen to her chest lifted until Louise was looking up at the ceiling with her arms stretched toward heaven. She rose to her feet. She walked out of that church alone, without her crutches, leaving them on the platform. Word spread from city to city as if carried on the wind. In Baltimore, a woman named Sarah Matthews, who had been blind from cataracts for 13 years, stood before Aimee in the Lyric Theater, and when Aimee placed oiled fingers on her eyelids and prayed, a burst of light erupted in the darkness. Sarah Matthews walked from the stage and described, in a clear voice, the stained glass windows she was seeing for the first time. In Washington, D.C., a boy named Russell Blassie, 10 years old, paralyzed in infancy, whose knees buckled together with every step, rose from the altar rail and walked. His mother's cry cut through the church like a knife. "My God, look at my son. He walks." And then Russell began to run. "Look, Mama, look. See how I can run. And it doesn't hurt me either." The newspapers tried to cover it soberly. They interviewed neighbors, examined medical records, talked to doctors. They printed names and addresses. Nicholas Berezovsky, 12 years old, Russian immigrant, dropped his brace at the altar and walked. The reporters wrote it all down because they had no other framework for what they were seeing. One journalist wrote, simply and pitifully, "The reporter watched the entire service." In Dayton, Ohio, the auditorium seats were unbolted from the floor to make room for the stretchers. In Alton, Illinois, a crowd of 10,000 stood in a schoolyard in summer heat while Aimee prayed for the sick for 6 straight hours without stopping to eat or drink. Goiters deflated on men's necks. Deaf ears opened. Spines straightened. A woman who had not walked in 8 years laid her crutches on a rafter above the altar and strolled home to her husband. He barely recognized her. In San Jose, 3 sisters, all born deaf, all daughters of a pastor, heard the sound of Aimee's voice. One by one, under her oiled hands and her prayers, the silence of their lifetimes broke. A reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle, who had come to debunk the meetings, wrote instead, "The blind saw again. The deaf heard. Cripples left their crutches and hung them on the rafter." What happened beneath that tent on San Jose field will probably sound like the veriest hocus pocus to many. But it happened. The American Medical Association of San Francisco sent representatives to investigate without telling the revival organizers. At the end of the week, their report was read aloud under the big top. The doctors certified that the healing work of Aimee Semple McPherson met with their approval in every way, and that the healings were genuine, beneficial, and wonderful. She had been called to China without a cent. She had started her ministry with a mildewed tent and bleeding hands. She had driven a car from New York to Los Angeles by herself when there were no proper roads, patching her own tires in the desert. And now she was building a church. The Angelus Temple rose on the edge of Echo Park in Los Angeles like a dream crystallized in concrete and steel, its great dome visible for 50 miles, a lighted cross rotating on its pinnacle at night. Inside, 5,300 seats curved around a stage that would become the most extraordinary platform of religious theater in 20th century America. The baptismal pool had a painted Jordan River for its backdrop. Carved above the proscenium arch in bold letters were the words, "Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever." She had raised every dollar of it from offerings, from the gypsies who stripped gold coins from their necks and carried them to her in heavy bags, from working-class families who gave 2 cents at a time, from the broken and the hopeful who had seen their own lives transformed. The Gypsy King, Dewey Mark, had been healed of respiratory disease under Aimee's hands in Denver. His mother was healed of a tumor that, witnesses swore, melted from her abdomen within 15 minutes of prayer. Mark spent the following year traveling the country on Aimee's behalf, summoning gypsy caravans to her meetings. They followed her from city to city in their wagons and colored tents, filling the front rows of every auditorium, weeping as she preached, calling her the Holy Lady, kissing her hands, stripping their jewelry for the offering. The gold and jewels of the American gypsies paid for the great stained glass windows of Angelus Temple. In Denver, the mayor sent his wife to be prayed for. She was lame from a fractured foot seized by arthritis. By the Wednesday after Aimee prayed for her on a Saturday, she was healed completely. The mayor mounted the platform and told 20,000 people that what Sister McPherson had done in that city, 2,000 years ago, would have been called a miracle. Later that tour, 1,000 Klansmen filed into Angelus Temple in their white hoods, expecting an ally. What they got was a sermon on the parable of a black farmer turned away from a beautiful church, who found Christ weeping on its steps, because he too had been trying to get in for many years. And the Klansmen fled the building one by one into the Echo Park night, leaving their robes and hoods abandoned in the bushes around the lake. On Sunday nights, scalpers sold tickets to Angelus Temple services outside the building. Traffic on the surrounding streets required special police details. Streetcar companies added extra trolleys. Mary Pickford came. Jean Harlow came. Anthony Quinn played saxophone in the Temple band as a teenager, too afraid to meet Aimee's eyes lest she see into his soul. He watched her preach the illustrated sermons, Moses and the Rock, the 10 Virgins, the Good Shepherd with his real sheep, and later in life, comparing her to every great actress he ever knew, he said they all fell short of the electric shock of Aimee Semple McPherson. Quinn's grandmother had been healed of a stomach ailment under the hands of Aimee's prayer workers. And during the Great Depression, when Quinn himself fainted from hunger on a Los Angeles street corner, he called the temple. Within an hour, a basket of food arrived at his door, no questions asked. She literally kept most of that Mexican community alive for many years, he would say decades later on national television, his voice breaking. And for that I'm eternally grateful. Because that is what she did during the Depression, when the bread lines stretched around blocks. When mothers could not feed their children. When the city's own welfare agencies buckled under the weight of suffering. Aimee Semple McPherson organized a commissary that fed 80,000 people in a single month. No one was interrogated about their immigration status. No one had to prove they deserved to eat. Give first, she said, and investigate afterward. Her policy was the policy of the kingdom. But behind the power, behind the platform, behind the revival that never seemed to end, there was a woman. And that woman was carrying wounds that would have destroyed almost anyone else. She never recovered fully from Robert Semple's death. The loneliness it left behind was a permanent bruise on her spirit that no amount of ministry could entirely soothe. Her second marriage ended in desertion. She left Harold McPherson, and she knew it, and the divorce, though necessary, cost her something she never got back. The public adulation that replaced human intimacy was a cold substitute. She had built a temple that held 5,000 people and preached to millions on the radio, but at night she went home to an empty room. She confided to colleagues, "You have no idea how lonesome I have been. I have been seeing myself home every night with a trip hammer in my throat." The isolation made her vulnerable. People she trusted, managers, lawyers, business partners, exploited the gap between her spiritual gifts and her practical blindness. One business deal after another went sideways. Cemetery plots sold with the slogan, "Go up with Aimee." A summer camp on Lake Tahoe that was supposed to attract 7,000 guests drew 100. $1 million lawsuit from a rejected associate. Legal bills that climbed toward the sky. All the while she preached 21 sermons a week, composed operas and oratorios, ran a radio station, directed illustrated theatrical sermons, taught theology, and ran the most extensive private welfare operation in Los Angeles. And then on May 18, 1926, she walked into the ocean at Ocean Park Beach in her green bathing suit, swam out past the waves until her secretary could no longer see her, and vanished. They found no body. 36 days of searching. Divers, planes, fishermen, thousands of followers on the beach at midnight, singing hymns in the moonlight, building bonfires, dancing in the spirit. And then she walked out of the desert. The story she told was of kidnapping. A man named Steve, a woman called Mexicali Rose, a shack in the desert, her wrists bound with bed ticking, a jagged tin can she used to cut herself free, 17 hours on foot through the Sonoran heat. The Los Angeles district attorney did not believe her. The newspapers did not believe her. The grand jury was convened. Her lawyers begged her to stay quiet. Her mother begged her to stay quiet. She refused. "My story is true," she declared from the radio, from the pulpit, from newspaper columns. "That's my story, boys, and I'm sticking to it." For 6 weeks she sat in a courtroom in Division 2 of Los Angeles Municipal Court while prosecutors called her a liar, a fraud, a hypocrite, and a harlot. Witnesses described alleged trysts. Reporters printed every salacious detail. The gallery was packed with people who had paid scalpers $25 for a reporter's pass. And Sister Aimee sat in that courtroom, day after day, dressed in her tailored suits, answering every question, swinging one crossed leg with a composure that infuriated her enemies. When they suggested the kidnapping was a publicity stunt, she said quietly, "You get in the same position and pray to the same God, and have the same courage that I have, and you would do likewise." When they pushed her further, she let down her long chestnut hair, accused of wearing a wig, and let it fall to her waist in full view of the stunned courtroom, to prove that nothing about her was fraudulent. The case was eventually dismissed. The charges collapsed when the prosecution's star witness changed her story for the third time. District Attorney Keyes, who later went to San Quentin on an unrelated bribery conviction, told the court, "Let her be judged in the only court of her jurisdiction, the court of public opinion." But the court of public opinion had already been shaped by 6 months of daily front-page headlines, and the damage to her reputation was permanent. She bore it. She went back into the pulpit. She preached the March of the Martyrs. She raised money for her defense from the offering plates. She toured 22 cities on a vindication tour, telling her story to packed theaters, and when she appeared at the Capitol Theater in New York on Broadway, Alexander Wolcott declared that she was magnificent and the house was full. She visited speakeasies and sat with dancers and drinkers and told them about the God who sees them, briefly, tenderly, without condemnation, and they applauded for far longer than the speech had taken. Through all of it, the lawsuits, the scandals, the prosecution, the divorce, a broken marriage to a man named David Hutton whose only gift to her seems to have been a fractured skull when the news of his legal defeat caused her to faint and strike her head on concrete. Through all of it, the healing never stopped. Quietly, in midweek services, in the 500 room at the temple, in the Wednesday healing services, she kept laying hands on the sick. A woman's leg, 2 inches shorter than the other for her entire life, was evened out under Aimee's prayer, and the woman stumbled and fell because the orthopedic lift in her shoe now made her lopsided. A man with a goiter the size of a grapefruit felt her cupped hand press against the swelling and watched, along with his doctors, as it deflated and disappeared. A child's new teeth grew in through healing gum tissue where the old ones had been. Students at the Bible College, required to attend healing services as part of their curriculum, sat in the gallery with notebooks and came away too shaken to write. She taught those students herself. In Spartan classrooms in the LIFE Bible College, she stood at a lectern with the measured precision of an aging prima ballerina, moving slowly because her joints were failing her, refusing the chair they offered her because once she sat down, it was so hard to get up again. She watched their faces as they prayed. She watched the shadow of spiritual struggle cross a young woman's brow and moved silently down the aisle to stand behind her, whispering a word, pressing a hand to a trembling shoulder, until the shadow lifted and the face was transfused with light. She told them to stay in the middle of the road, not timid and cold like the institutional church, not excessive and frightening like the emotional extremes of the revival, but bold, warm, full of power held in reserve, like an engine that can do 80 miles an hour but moves tenderly through city streets. She wrote an opera. She wrote theology. She composed hymns at 2 a.m, calling upon God aloud, so her housemate came to the door in alarm. "I am not going to let the devil take away from me the words and music that God has put in my heart," she told them, and went back to the typewriter. She preached Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs as a sermon on sin and salvation. She preached Little Red Riding Hood with a Bible student in a wolf costume. She preached Showboat with bales of cotton on the platform and a black choir singing the gospel words to Old Man River. She sold $150,000 worth of war bonds in a single afternoon in Pershing Square, dressed in a red and blue cape, raising her fist over a crowd of 20,000, calling the nation to its duty. The Army made her an honorary colonel. She went to the radio and told housewives how to conserve gasoline. She had her students deliver New Testaments, personally, to every serviceman who attended Sunday services at the temple. She visited Mahatma Gandhi in his ashram in Verda and sat at his feet while he spun cotton and spoke of economic justice for the poor. She met Mussolini in Rome a year before he invaded Ethiopia and came home with a prophetic dread ringing in her ears that she poured into her preaching, warning from the pulpit of Angelus Temple that the world was winding up to war, a war so destructive it would make the first one look like a tournament. She cried this from the stage in 1936, while Hitler and Mussolini were signing their pact. Nobody outside her congregation listened. And through all of it, her body was failing. Arthritis had crept into her knees until they crackled like parchment when she knelt to pray. A ureter condition that went misdiagnosed for years caused recurring fevers and required frequent blood transfusions in her final years. She had lost 40 pounds. She slept in snatches. She was in constant pain. Her nurse noticed that the lights in her bedroom never went out, and that she cried out to God through the night. And yet she went into that classroom. She went onto that stage. She preached 21 sermons a week. She laid hands on the sick. She fed the hungry. She answered the telephone calls of desperate mothers and addicted men and suicidal wives, because the prayer tower she had built, where volunteers prayed in 2-hour shifts, around the clock, every day, from the moment the temple opened until the day she died, answered every call, and many of those calls still came to her personally. The estrangement from her daughter Roberta, caused in part by the maneuvering of the men Aimee mistakenly trusted, was perhaps the deepest wound of her later years. She had loved Roberta with a mother's full heart, even if the weight of her calling had sometimes kept her from showing it. But the events of 1936 and 1937 drove a legal and personal wedge between them that neither woman was able to bridge before the end. In a photograph from the final courtroom session they shared, Aimee is kneeling beside her daughter's chair, their hands clasped across a corner of a table, whispering with a face ravaged by the effort to hold things together. Roberta looks down at her mother with an expression that is not anger, not bitterness, only pity, and a sorrow too large for the room it sat in. They would not see each other again. She reconciled with almost no one before the end. Her mother Minnie, who had walked with her through 30 years of harvest and wreckage, who had counted the offering and booked the halls and stood beside her through the grand jury and the kidnapping trial and all the rest, Minnie too was gone from her orbit in those final years, watching from a distance in Hermosa Beach, occasionally sending word through Roberta, unable to reach her daughter through the walls of circumstance and pride that had grown up between them. In September of 1944, Aimee Semple McPherson flew to Oakland to dedicate a new Foursquare church. She was 53 years old and had been managing her pain with sedatives for years. The night before her final sermon, she was to preach on the story of my life. She stood at the open window of her hotel room and listened to an airplane roaring overhead through the Oakland blackout darkness. She said to her son Rolf, who was with her, "I wonder, when we die, if we will be riding around in airplanes?" Rolf kissed her goodnight and left. In the dark of that hotel room, she took her sleeping capsules. She was not sure how many she had taken. Some fell to the pillow. Some fell to the floor. She lay in the dark and closed her eyes and thought perhaps of China, and of Robert Semple who had died there, and of the girl she had been on the farm in Salford, standing at the windless well calling to her own reflection. She had spent her whole life pursuing that reflection, and the closer she got to it, the more it looked like Christ. At 10 the next morning, Rolf found her unconscious in her bed. The capsules were on the pillow and on the floor. He could not wake her. At 11:45 on September 27, 1944, Aimee Semple McPherson was pronounced dead. The Angelus temple chimes, programmed to ring at noon, hung silent in the belfry. 60,000 people filed past her casket over 3 days. She lay on the stage she had built, in a white gown and her long blue cape, holding the white-bound Bible, wrapped in gardenias and roses. The stage was so full of flowers that 5 carloads more were turned away at the door. Florists said they had never seen anything like it. The invoice for orchids alone was $10,000. From all over America, they came to say, "There lies the woman who led me to Jesus. There lies the woman who opened my deaf ears. There is the woman who fed my children when there was nothing left to eat." Harold McPherson, her second husband, the one she had left, the one who remarried and rebuilt his life in Florida and received her monthly checks without bitterness, took a relay of buses from Ocala to be with Rolf in his grief. Roberta, who could not get a flight from New York in time, arrived after the funeral, stepped off the plane into Los Angeles with an infant daughter on her hip, and found her mother already in the ground. Minnie Kennedy walked behind the hearse to the tomb on Sunrise Slope, escorted by the lawyer Joseph Feiner, weeping without restraint. She had lived 53 years. She had preached to more people than any woman who ever lived. She had built a church with her own hands and a denomination that today encompasses 17,000 congregations in 100 nations. She had healed the sick, fed the poor, housed the homeless, warned the complacent, confronted the powerful, loved the despised, and refused, absolutely refused, to put down the bucket she had been given to carry. If there is a lesson in the life of Aimee Semple McPherson, and there is more than one, perhaps it begins here. The same God who called her into suffering. Not around it. Through it. The loss of Robert Semple did not disqualify her from healing the sick. It was the very thing that made her believe with every fiber of her being that God could restore what death had taken. The years of mockery and persecution did not silence her voice. They gave her a sermon. The loneliness she never fully escaped, that trip hammer in her throat on every dark evening, never stopped her from getting up in the morning and pouring herself out for the person in front of her. She was not perfect. The biography does not suggest she was. She made catastrophic choices in business and in love. She trusted the wrong people. She was stubborn in ways that cost her the people she loved most. She was sometimes naive to the point of recklessness, and sometimes so proud that she walked into battles she could not win simply because she refused to back down. She was human, fully and completely. But in the moments that mattered most, on the chair in Mount Forest, on the platform in Philadelphia during the riot, in the courtroom with her hair falling to her waist, in the classroom with her arthritic knees crackling as she knelt, in the Sonoran Desert at dawn, walking 17 hours on bleeding feet back to the light, in all those moments, she did what she had always done since a 4-year-old girl got knocked down by a bull and got back up, still holding the bucket. She got up. She went forward. She trusted the voice. The voice that had spoken over her before she was born. The voice that answered her mother's prayer on a cold Ontario afternoon in 1890, parting clouds over an orchard and sending a single shaft of light through a farmhouse window. The voice that spoke to her on the operating table when she thought she was dying. The voice that called her back from the edge time after time with the same insistent question. Now, will you go? And every time, every single time, she said yes. May her life stir something in yours. May her courage challenge your comfort. May her willingness to carry the bucket, no matter what knocked her down, remind you that you were also not put here by accident. You were prayed for, perhaps before you were born, by someone who believed God had a purpose only you could fill. The fields are still waiting. The voice is still calling. Will you go? If this story moved you, stirred your faith, or reminded you of why you believe, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of the heroes of faith who walked this earth before us. These are the cloud of witnesses cheering you on. Let their lives not be forgotten. And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching the story of Aimee Semple McPherson today. Your location might be exactly the place where the next revival begins.